I want to ask you something. When you think about climate change, what do you feel? Because for many people I speak with, it's not just a concern, it's something deeper, a low grade dread, a sense of helplessness, the feeling that the problem is so vast, so complex, so overwhelming that nothing you do could possibly matter. And then there's guilt about feeling that way, or numbness because the feeling is too much, or frantic activity to kind of avoid the feeling altogether. Today, we're going to examine climate anxiety, not just as personal distress, but as a window into how we relate to problems that exceed our individual scale. Because what's happening with climate is also happening in our organizations, our relationships, our sense of agency in the world. I'm Rahul Nair, and this is the Huddle Institute podcast show. Welcome to episode 2. So, let's start with what's happening. Climate anxiety is real and widespread. Studies show that nearly 70% of young adults report significant distress about climate change. Terms like eco anxiety, climate grief, and environmental melancholia have entered our vocabulary. And here's what's interesting, this isn't about the weather getting warmer. It's about confronting a problem that violates every assumption our brains make about how problems actually work. Climate change is the following: slow moving, in other words, no immediate threat to trigger survival response. It's diffuse, in other words, no clear enemy, no single cause. It's delayed. Actions today have consequences decades away. It's collective. It requires coordination at scales we've not really managed ever before. And it's, of course, uncertain because we're dealing with probabilities, not certainties. We're dealing with thresholds we might cross. In other words, it's perfectly designed to overwhelm our psychological and social systems. And look at how we're responding. Some people deny it entirely, not because they are necessarily stupid, but because the reality is just unbearable. Others acknowledge it but remain passive, paralyzed by the very scale. Still others throw themselves into frantic action, trying to control the uncontrollable only to burn out in the process. The same patterns show up in other places, everywhere. At work, people face organizational change that feels too big to influence. In relationships, we're talking about confronting patterns that seem too entrenched to shift. In our inner lives, too, we deal with parts of ourselves that feel overwhelming. The climate crisis isn't just out there, it's revealing something about how we, as individuals and collectives, handle complexity that exceeds our sense of agency. So, let's dig deeper. From a psychological perspective, why does climate change create such profound distress? Well, first, our brains evolved to respond to immediate and visible threats. Let's assume there is a lion charging at you. Your amygdala fires, you get a surge of adrenaline, you fight or flee. Clear threat, clear response, clear resolution. But climate change, it's a creeping, abstract, probabilistic threat. Your survival system doesn't know what to do with that. So it kind of vacillates between hypervigilance, which is constant worry, and numbing, shutting down to avoid overwhelm. Neither response is very helpful. Then there's what psychologists call finite pool of worry. We have limited emotional bandwidth. When a problem feels too big, too unsolvable, we unconsciously shift our attention to problems we can control. Your recycling, your diet, your carbon footprint. Not because these don't matter, but because sometimes focusing on them lets us avoid the larger sense of helplessness. This is what's also called single action bias, doing one thing to reduce anxiety, then feeling we've done enough. It's psychologically protective, but systemically perhaps insufficient. There's also temporal discounting. What I mean by that is our brains value immediate rewards over distant consequences. Climate impacts feel way far away, very far away, even though they're already here for many communities, which we've seen on television. So we struggle to prioritize them over immediate concerns like paying rent or meeting work deadlines. Add to this what researchers call apocalypse fatigue. We've been warned about a climate catastrophe for decades. After a while, the constant alarm creates a kind of desensitization. You see, the mind cannot sustain crisis mode indefinitely. And then there's the moral dimension. Climate change raises excruciating questions about complicity. You're driving a car using plastic, consuming products shipped across oceans. You're both a victim and a perpetrator at the same time. That cognitive dissonance, i.e., knowing you're contributing to something you oppose, creates shame, guilt, and sometimes even defensive denial. For young people, there's this additional layer that we need to note, and that is betrayal. The generation inheriting this crisis didn't create it, but they are being asked to solve it. That breeds rage, grief, and a profound sense of injustice. There's also what psychologists call solastalgia, distress caused by environmental change in your home environment. It's a kind of homesickness, while still at home. The seasons kind of feel wrong. The birds, they sound different. The glacier you visited as a child is no more or is gone. You're losing your sense of place, of continuity, of predictability. And finally, climate anxiety often connects to deeper existential questions. If the world as we know it might fundamentally change, then what's the point of planning, of having children, of building anything? So, psychologically, we are dealing with a threat our brains weren't designed to process, moral injury from complicity, a sense of helplessness at scales beyond individual control, grief for what's already lost and what might be lost, and existential questions about meaning and the future. No wonder people feel paralyzed. But the question is, why did we create systems that generate threats at scales we cannot psychologically manage? That's where philosophy comes in. Philosophically, climate change forces us to confront some of our deepest assumptions. First, the assumption of human dominion over nature. For centuries, Western thought positioned humans as separate and superior to the natural world. Nature was a resource, something to be mastered, exploited, controlled. Descartes' famous divide between mind and matter, culture and nature, gave philosophical permission to treat the earth as a machine, neutral, passive, there for our use or even abuse. But climate change reveals the limits of that paradigm. We're not separate from nature, we're rather embedded in it. And our actions have consequences we can't fully predict or control. The fantasy, the fantasy of dominion collapses. And then there's the question of intergenerational ethics. Moral philosophy, most of it at least, focuses on present obligations, what I owe you, what we owe each other now. But climate change asks, what do we owe people who do not exist yet? Philosopher Derek Parfit explored this through thought experiments. If our actions today affect the quality of life for people born in 2100, for example, are we obligated to control and constrain our behavior? How much sacrifice is justified for hypothetical future people? And it's more complex. It gets more complex. The people most affected by climate change, island nations, drought stricken regions, vulnerable communities, they are often those who contributed least to causing the problem in the first place. And this raises profound questions of justice. The philosopher Henry Shue talks about basic rights, rights to security and subsistence that must be protected. Climate change threatens these rights for millions of people. So the wealthy nations that benefited from fossil fuel use have, he says, a quote unquote responsibility to remedy, not just for the harm caused, but for the systemic injustice. There's also the problem of scale and agency. Classical ethics assumes I can see the consequences of my actions and adjust accordingly. But climate change severs that connection mercilessly. My individual actions, like driving, consuming, living, whatever it may be, are diffused across billions of people aggregated over decades. I can't see how my choices contribute to the problem, which makes moral accountability feel difficult, if not impossible. The philosophers call this moral corruption. Systems that dissolve individual responsibility until no one feels accountable. Then there's the question of growth. Modern society is premised on the idea of continuous economic growth. More production, more consumption, more GDP. But on a finite planet, infinite growth is, well, impossible. Philosophers like Kate Raworth ask, what if flourishing doesn't require endless growth? What if there's a sweet spot, enough for everyone to live well without exceeding planetary boundaries? This challenges one of capitalism's core assumptions. And because our identities, securities, and futures are tied to that system, questioning it feels, in many ways, destabilizing. Finally, there's the question of sacrifice. Climate action requires limiting consumption, changing lifestyles, prioritizing collective good over individual convenience. In cultures built on personal freedom and choice, that's a bit of a hard sell. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre argues we've lost the vocabulary of quote unquote the common good. The idea that I might constrain my freedom for our collective flourishing, for our collective well being. We have rights, but not responsibilities in the deeper sense. So, philosophically, climate change exposes the following: the illusion of human separation from nature, our failure to account for intergenerational and global justice, the limits of individual agency in systemic problems, the unsustainability of infinite growth, and the absence of a shared ethic that prioritizes collective flourishing. These aren't just abstract debates, they shape policy, behavior, and ultimately our planet's future, which brings us to the spiritual lens. Spiritually, climate change is asking us the deepest question: what is our relationship to life itself? Across spiritual traditions, there's teaching about interconnection. In indigenous wisdom, this is often expressed through kinship with all beings, trees, rivers, animals, earth, not metaphorically, but literally. You are relatives. Chief Seattle's famous words: the earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. In Buddhism, it's the doctrine of dependent origination. Everything arises in relation to everything else. Your breath depends on trees. Trees, in turn, depend on soil. Soil depends on decomposing and decomposes. One, it's one vast, interdependent web. In Christian theology, there's the concept of creation care. Humans as stewards, not owners, responsible for tending what's been entrusted to us. In Advaita Vedanta, the teaching is even more radical. The self and the world are not even seen as separate. Thou art that. Harming the earth is essentially harming your own being. But we've forgotten this. We've created a culture that treats the earth as dead matter, as a resource, as something external to ourselves. And that forgetting creates what Thomas Berry called a spiritual autism, an inability to hear the voices of the earth, to feel our kinship, to sense our belonging. Climate anxiety, then, isn't just a psychological distress, it's also a kind of spiritual grief. Mourning the loss of a relationship, the severing of a connection, the forgetting of who we are in the web of life. Joanna Macy, the Buddhist scholar and systems thinker, talks about, quote unquote, the work that reconnects, practices that help us remember our interconnection and find the strength to act from that remembrance rather than from fear or guilt. Because here's what's crucial: if you act on climate change only from fear, you burn out. If you act only from guilt, you become rigid and judgmental. If you act only from anger, you alienate potential allies. But if you act from love, from a felt sense of connection to all beings, from grief that's honored, from a recognition that you're part of something sacred, if you act from love, that sustains you. This is where awe becomes essential. Research done by Dagger Keltner at Berkeley and others shows that experiences of awe, standing beneath ancient trees, watching a murmuration of starlings, witnessing the birth of a child, these experiences diminish the ego and increase pro-social behavior. Awe reminds us we are part of something vast, something beautiful, something worth protecting. Climate action rooted in spiritual connection looks different than climate action rooted in fear. It's less about saving the planet. The planet will be fine. It's survived worse, to be honest. And more about honoring our place in the web of life. It's asking, What does love require of me? Not in the abstract, but right now, in this body, on this earth, with these neighbors, with this generation of children watching. And it means making peace with uncertainty. Spiritually, we're being asked to act without guarantees of success, to do what's right because it's right, not because we are assured it will work. This is what the Bhagavad Gita teaches. Do your duty without attachment to results, what Buddhism calls effortless effort, full engagement without clinging to outcomes. Now, let's look at the system. Climate change is a perfect example of what Donella Meadows called a policy resistance problem. Everyone pushing hard, but the system pushing back harder. Here's why: feedback delays. You emit carbon today, the warming happens over decades. By the time you see the full consequences, you've already committed to more warming. These delays mean we're all always reacting to past actions, not preventing future harm. Number two, diffuse responsibility. Climate change is caused by billions of individual actions aggregated over time. No one person or nation is, quote unquote, the problem. This diffuses accountability to the point where everyone can point to someone else. Thirdly, tragedy of the commons. Each actor, nation, company, individual benefits from using the atmosphere but doesn't bear the full cost. So everyone has an incentive to emit, even though collective emissions harm everyone. Classic prisoner's dilemma at global scale. Then there's structural lock in. Our infrastructure, cities, transportation, energy is built around fossil fuels. Changing requires coordinated transformation of deeply embedded systems. That's not impossible, but it's extraordinarily difficult. Then we have reinforcing loops. Climate impacts, maybe droughts, floods, fires, they tend to destabilize communities, which leads to conflict and migration, which makes cooperation harder, which delays climate action, which worsens impacts. The system is self reinforcing in the wrong direction. Then there's power dynamics. Those benefiting most from the status quo, fossil fuel companies, wealthy nations, have the most power to resist change. Those most harmed, in other words, vulnerable nations, future generations, have the least power to demand it. So, we're trapped in a system where the problem is created collectively but felt individually. The costs are delayed and diffuse. The beneficiaries of inaction hold power. The structure resists change. And finally, feedback loops accelerating harm. No wonder individual action feels rather futile. You're trying to shift a system designed to resist the shift. But And this is crucial. Systems can change. They have leverage points. Meadows identified them. Places to intervene, from parameters least effective to paradigms which are the most effective. Changing individual behavior parameters helps but isn't sufficient. Necessary, not sufficient. Changing policy rules helps more. Changing entire economic structures, incentives, helps even more. But the deepest leverage, changing the paradigm. The story we tell about who we are and what we are here for. From humans dominate nature to humans belong to nature. From growth equals progress to flourishing within limits. From I'm separate to we're interconnected. That shift in consciousness, replicated across enough people, changes everything else. So, given all this, where does your agency live? At the personal level, feel the grief. Don't numb it or transcend it prematurely. Grief is love with nowhere to go. Let it clarify what you really care about. Cultivate awe. Spend time in nature. Let beauty remind you what's at stake and resource your capacity to act. Reduce your footprint, of course, but don't stop there. Individual action matters morally, but it's not sufficient systemically. Talk about it. Break the silence. Your honest conversation gives others permission. At the relational level, build community around this. Isolated action breeds burnout. Collective action, on the other hand, builds resilience. Practice active hope, Macy's term. Hope as a verb, not feeling. You hope through your actions, not despite them. At the structural level, vote. Every election at every level shapes climate policy. Advocate. Contact representatives. Join campaigns. Collective political pressure shifts what's possible. Support systemic solutions, renewable energy transitions, public transportation, regenerative agriculture, carbon pricing. Work where you have leverage. If you're in finance, push for divestment. In education, shape curriculum. In media, change narratives. At the paradigm level, question growth. Ask what's enough? What actually makes life worth living? Practice belonging to earth, not ownership of it. Tell new stories. The dominant narrative says we're doomed or we're saved. Neither is true. We're in the messy middle, and the outcome isn't written. And here's what's crucial: you don't have to do everything, you don't have to save the world alone. Find your piece, the work that's yours to do. given your gifts, your position, your relationships, your context. Do that with integrity and love. Trust that others are doing their piece. Together, we create the web of response. The paralysis comes from thinking you have to solve the whole problem yourself. You don't. You have to show up for your part. Climate change is overwhelming by design. It's a problem that exceeds individual scale, challenges our very assumptions, and asks us to transform systems we're embedded in. But here's what I've learned: the paralysis isn't from the size of the problem, it's from the story that you're alone with it. You're not. Millions of people around the world are waking up to this, innovating, organizing, changing systems from inside, planting trees, installing solar, rewriting policy, teaching children, grieving together, building resilience. Your action matters, not because it will single handedly solve climate change, but because it's part of a larger pattern. Patterns shift when enough parts shift. Patterns shift when enough parts shift. And beyond outcomes, there's the question of integrity. How do you want to have lived during this moment in history? What do you want to be able to say you did? Not out of guilt, but out of love. So here's the question for you to sit with this week. What are you grieving about the climate crisis? And what does that grief reveal about what you love and what you're called to protect? What are you grieving about? The climate crisis? And what does that grief reveal about what you love and what you're called to protect? I'm Rahul Nair. This has been the Huddle Institute podcast show. Next Tuesday, we'll examine our relationship with artificial intelligence and what our fears reveal about us. Until then, go outside, touch a tree, and remember you belong here. Ciao for now.